just want to thank Sundram Fasteners and the Banyan. This is a tremendous honor to be speaking today. So I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief and really coming out of my 30 plus years of working with homelessness, and particularly persons with serious mental illness who have been homeless for sometimes periods of years or decades. So what I'd like to start out with is, why is the right to housing so, this is a theme of my talk today, is why is the right to housing so missing from so much? We talk about it, but we don't really get serious about it. And if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 goals. It's hard to find where the right to housing or a goal of housing for all is found. And as best as I can ascertain from the UN's work, it's buried somewhere in goal number 11, sustainable cities and communities. But that's something I'd like to speak about today, is just the right to housing and how it seems to not be put forth in a way that actually addresses what I consider to be one of the world's most pressing, urgent problems. The logic of the moment is, as I see it, particularly here in the West, we talk about, well, the Lancet series was no health without mental health. And that was a very powerful phrase, that health was redefined and expanded to include mental health. And now we're in an era where we talk about housing is health. That is, you cannot really have health without housing. And so I've taken it the next step and said that how can you have mental health without housing? But I would also add that housing is necessary, but not always sufficient. And I'm talking about people with serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and my own research finding that housing is absolutely necessary, but also many of these individuals, not all of them, but many do need additional supports. And my belief is those supports should come with a value or an ethos of choice and inclusion in what those supports involve. So housing is necessary, but not sufficient for the subset of homeless persons who have serious mental illness. We are in what I call the housing first era in the West. I think most people seem to agree it's in kind of the public discourse. It is the national policy in Canada. It is still, except for a brief time under the former president, was the US policy of promoting housing first, and that I'll explain a bit about what that is. But the extent to which housing first is used in the US and Canada can be open to question, because there has been a fair amount of what I call the shelter industry, particularly here in New York City, and a certain amount of passive resistance to housing first from various quarters. But nevertheless, housing first is practiced in virtually every European nation now. It has been tested and pilot tested and randomized, trialed in several of these nations. And it also has a very solid presence in Australia and New Zealand. So I would like to just offer that housing first in a fairly short period of time of decades has really come to challenge the traditional approach to dealing with homelessness. And in this case, I'll be speaking specifically to homelessness for persons with serious mental illness, because this is where housing first began here in New York City, specifically for persons with serious mental illness who were homeless. And of course, the success story of all success stories is Finland. You probably can't see the fuzzy print, but basically Finland adopted housing first and has gone into the media and the Twitterverse and everywhere as being the only country really that is on target to eliminate homelessness using housing first and relying heavily on social housing, working under the Y Foundation there. And so Finland is we point to as a country that really put the resources behind housing first and really brought about a dramatic drop in homelessness. And they are targeted by 2025 to have eliminated homelessness from the country of Finland. No other country has come this close to success in reducing the rate of homelessness so quickly in such a short time. It is the story of Housing First, and I wrote it with Sam Tsimberis, who founded Housing First, the whole principle of it here in New York City, and with Ben Hinwood, who's a former student of mine who's worked closely and is now in Los Angeles working diligently with Los Angeles County and the city around homelessness in California. And also, just to reiterate how Housing First has made such an impression, there is a guide now just for European nations to implement Housing First in their homeless policies. And as I mentioned earlier, virtually all Western European countries have Housing First programs. That's not to say it's the national policy or that it has penetrated all aspects of the homeless service sector, but Housing First is well known in Europe now and widely accepted. So what is Housing First not? What is it going up against? Well, I can only speak primarily from the US and particularly from a New York point of view, but what we call the non-Housing First approach is a staircase or the treatment first. And this is where a homeless person must go to a shelter and then be ascertained if they have a serious mental illness or addiction or other problems. For a person who is ascertained to have a serious mental illness, if they are fortunate, they may spend days or weeks or months in a shelter. And I want to emphasize that the shelters are very unpleasant places to be in New York City. But if they do qualify through having a psychiatric disability, they may move into supportive housing. And supportive housing, or sometimes called permanent supportive housing, is an arrangement where these individuals, they usually live in congregate buildings, but they do have on-site support, social workers, they have visiting psychiatrists, and so forth. In my own research, permanent supportive housing is definitely preferable to a shelter or to the streets, but it is not necessarily what these individuals want. They want the same recovery-oriented, normal, so-called normal life of living in permanent housing. So where they often fall off is in the shelter system, because persons with serious mental illness, it's very hard to live in a close quarters, unsafe, and particularly now during COVID situation. So the potential for dropout is very high in the shelters. New York City does not publish that information, but we know from interviewing people on the street that many of them have had shelter experience and do not want to go back. So if they get into supportive housing, that is a plus, but it is not their ultimate preference. But we now have thousands and thousands of supportive housing units in New York City, and there still are not enough dwelling units for the demand, that is the number of people who qualify through psychiatric disability but cannot get a placement or a bed in supportive housing. And then the ultimate goal of permanent independent housing for a person with a serious mental illness is very difficult. It's not impossible, but for most of these individuals, they are kind of stuck on the staircase if they haven't dropped out in supportive housing. And for many of them, due to recovery and getting better and over the passage of time, health improving, they want to move on to have their own place. And this is the ultimate goal that they would like to have. So what's happened with the staircase system is people fall off the staircase, literally. They leave, they relapse, or they cannot abide the crowded, the noise, the unsafety of the shelters. So what we have is what we call the institutional circuit, which is Kim Hopper's term for they return to the streets. They may go in and out of shelters. They're often hospitalized or in detox arrangements or put in jail for minor infractions. What this adds up to is a very expensive formula for doing nothing or for allowing people to not be put into housing right away And I'm not a believer in cost effectiveness solutions, but I can tell you that it is far more expensive in this country to allow people to continue to be homeless than to put them actually into permanent independent housing. So this is the staircase according to Housing First. One comes in with a serious mental illness, maybe comorbid substance abuse problems, and is immediately put into an apartment. The original version was a scatter site, having their own apartment. This is not housing only. That is, the person is placed in an apartment, hopefully of their choice. Of course, it's a studio or a one-bedroom. Part of their disability income, up to 30%, goes to helping to pay the rent. But what's really important is they get assertive case management, supportive services in the apartments, and are not just left alone to adjust to independent living. They're given a lot of help. But the key element of Housing First is choice. So if many people that Housing First have placed have done just fine with minimal amounts of help, others need more help. And that's where Housing First titrates the amount of support services to go with that need of the person and center it around their choice. So the evidence base is extremely robust. Canada did a national $110 million randomized trial. There's been a randomized trial in France. We've done one here in New York. The evidence is consistent that Housing First keeps people housed at about an 85% rate after 1 year. And although there are differences in outcomes in terms of mental stability, addiction, or use of substances, they do stay stably housed, and it does end homelessness. This is not to say, as I will say a little bit later, that this is the end of all their problems. But at any rate, I want to say that the evidence base is very robust for Housing First. And I will also say that there is no evidence that shelters bring about any positive outcomes. There's no research for the non-Housing First approach in terms of positive outcomes. And this is just an idea. This is Albuquerque, New Mexico, where they've applied Housing First. Just seeing the change in the person's physical appearance, you can see the effects of coming indoors, getting support, leaving the streets. I have witnessed it in literally hundreds of people, and it's quite moving to see. So I have a few more comments to make about Housing First in a global context. Obviously, there are challenges in the global South. The number of unhoused, precariously housed is very high. The available housing units are very limited. In my own research on pavement dwellers in Delhi, I found that private charity was very important, and that the government role compared to here in terms of spending and availability of shelters is very limited. And I'd also note that Housing First is obviously a very Western invention, and sometimes the fit in the global South may need to be adapted to cultural preferences. For example, we kind of emphasize individualism, living alone, having your own place to live, and so forth. I'd also like to point out that practitioner issues are important in Housing First, because the social workers and the nurses and the psychiatrists, for most of those individuals, and I'm an anthropologist, so I can't speak for them, but I teach in a school of social work, and I'm very sympathetic and admiring of the work, but the work has to be in the community in Housing First, not just the clinic. And it involves decision-making, sharing with clients. It involves putting away any personal prejudices you have or stereotypes about mental illness or about substance use. It requires kind of a power sharing and less of a reinforcing the professional expertise of the practitioner and more treating the client or the tenant as someone who knows themselves best and honoring their preferences. And it also involves supervision. It really requires that frontline staff get the support they need, because this is tough work to work with individuals. It's also very rewarding work, but supervision is very helpful in this context. So I just want to put the Banyan here. I know we're coming back to that, but I just want to say I have been there, I have taught there. I am extremely proud of what all of the fantastic people at the Banyan have done. And the Home Again model, in my eyes, comes very close to Housing First, because it's non-institutional settings, it's consumer choice, and the success and the scaling up of it has been phenomenal. And so I just want to say, from my perspective, I hold it up to all my colleagues as an excellent example. And I know we'll come back to this. So a few final remarks around structural obstacles. Whether it's Housing First or anywhere, we face a global shortage of habitable, affordable housing. In the West, in most governments, we have what we call a neoliberal kind of privatization, so that housing in this country is largely left up to private developers. It's kind of a market-driven phenomenon. So there's very few incentives to build affordable housing for even low-income people, much less homeless individuals. There are rising inequities in income and wealth the world over. This has been demonstrated time and again, that the concentration of wealth in the hands of a shrinking number of people. And what this is doing is expanding the demand for housing as population grows, but shrinking the supply. And I can talk a little bit about that in the discussion if you want, in terms of how global equity companies are buying up housing in this country and squeezing out even low-income tenants. But my biggest question, I guess, today is it feels like there's some existential human bond to land and housing that helps me understand maybe why people, even the United Nations, shies away from really asserting the concept of housing as a right for all. Why is it that when this comes up in New York or California or whatever, you're accused of saying something that's really off the chart? It's not even, it's almost an untouchable subject. And why is the right to housing an untouchable subject? Well, I'll offer a few thoughts and say that we have had an exponential growth in global population. So the need for housing skyrockets. We have a shrinking land base as we grow mega cities of 25, 30 million people crowded into smaller land base. And then of course the agricultural sector grows smaller, both in population and in available land. And there's a lack of infrastructure in many parts of the world to even make housing provision possible. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, the privatization of land and housing, and therefore there's no move as there was in earlier decades for social housing, council housing, that kind of public housing as we call it here. The governments seem to be almost out of that business of building housing and leaving it up to the private sector. And then finally, I think climate change is removing from habitability gradually but surely and slowly areas of land that might be habitable. And this is happening slowly but right in front of our eyes. So getting back to persons with serious mental illness, I just want to say that even with housing, we are acutely aware that these individuals have a shortened lifespan. Particularly, I'm talking about formerly homeless individuals, 20 to 25 years less of a life expectancy. So when we are talking to someone who's 50 years old, their health and their future is about 20 years is ahead of them. In other words, they're about 70 years old physically. So poor physical health, a lot of injuries from living on the streets, a lack of work history and education due to often early onset of serious mental illness, interrupting lives, interrupting life trajectories. We find a lot of history of trauma going all the way back to childhood in talking to these individuals and interviewing. And virtually all of my work, by the way, has been qualitative, so it's in depth interviews with individuals either on the street, but by and large, most of them are in some form of housing after having spent years of being homeless without a home. And then finally, depleted social networks. What we find with these individuals is through various reasons, often through premature mortality in their own families, amongst their peers, incarceration, many reasons, their support networks are very depleted and they have very few supports outside of the formal system of care to turn to. So I say that these are, even Housing First can't resolve all of these issues and should not be expected to. It's just there to give people a safe place to live and to recover a life. But imagine all of these problems without housing. And that's what we have happening today in too many parts of this country, is individuals suffering through these problems, including individuals with serious mental illness, and suffering through them living in a tent or on a sidewalk. So I end my talk with my favorite colorful pyramid of Maslow and say that housing is fundamental, that, as I said earlier, I don't think you can have health without mental health, and you can't have mental health without housing. And so I want to stop there and thank you very much.